My material's not copyrighted. You can use mine any way you want.
Citizens of the internet,
If you want to get any of my video materials, they're not copyrighted.
arise, here's another idiot that we can criticize. But if we choose to base our arguments on emotion, we are no better than Kent Hovind. So come on, come on, come on.
It's logic
Come on, come on, come on.
It's logic
Come on, come on, come on.
It's logic
Come on, come on.
It's logic
It is assumed the ratio of radioactive carbon-14 to normal C12 in the atmosphere would be the same found in living plants and animals. That is an assumption, but it's a reasonable assumption. Since half of it will leave in 5,730 years, all you got to do is check to see how much C14 is in it, how much C14 is in the atmosphere, and if it's only got half as much, it's been dead for 5,730 years. Sounds great.
You know what the weird thing is? You're kind of right. It really doesn't sound that bad. You talked for a really long time there without saying anything particularly crazy, so I actually had to cut a lot of it out for time. But that actually wasn't too bad of an overview of how radiocarbon dating works. It's so weird.
But it doesn't work. In theory, it never goes to zero, but it goes from a half to a fourth to an eighth to a 16th to a 32nd to not much, okay? After 4 or 5 half-lives, you can't measure it. So if anybody ever tells you, we know the Earth is millions of years old because of carbon dating,
Which they don't, unless they're not all that bright.
you can rest assured they don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Correct.
Because if it worked, it would only work for 30 or 40 or 50,000 years maximum.
Yes, indeed. I mean, like I said, I skipped most of your speech about how carbon dating works in the interest of time, but you actually seem to accept it as a reliable technique. You said it was based on reasonable assumptions and that there was a good probability that the half-life wouldn't deviate much from the proposed 5,730 years. It's surprising that you'd be so gracious, considering that if radiocarbon dating is reliable, that means anything dated at more than 6,000 years old, which is a lot of stuff, is actually over 6,000 years old, which would debunk young Earth creationism. So I have a sneaking suspicion that you have a little bit more to say about this.
They compare the amount of C14 in the object being dated with the amount currently in the atmosphere.
Not for the last, 50 or 60 years? So now you're relying on 60-year-old science for your arguments? Well, finally, it was about time for an update.
And estimate how long the object has been dead. It sounds good.
No, it doesn't. What if the amount of carbon-14 changed over the past 50,000 years? I mean, we know the magnetic field of the Earth prevents some solar radiation from entering the atmosphere.
The Earth's atmosphere is about 100 miles thick, and we're also protected by a magnetic field. Radiation from the sun and from the stars, mostly from the sun, goes right through that magnetic field. Some of it does.
And we know that radiation entering the atmosphere is responsible for production of carbon-14.
And hits the atmosphere and produces carbon-14.
And we know the magnetic field fluctuates, so no, it really doesn't sound good. Come on, Kent, try to keep up.
But there are some assumptions that mess everything up, okay? Assumption number 1, has the amount of C14 in the atmosphere always been the same?
Ha, there you are. A bit slow, but you caught up. No, the amount of C14 in the atmosphere has not always been the same.
Well, Willard Libby and others who invented carbon-14, University of Chicago in 1947 to 53, he got a Nobel Prize for it in there somewhere. He said, well, it would take 30,000 years to reach equilibrium. He said, well, we know the Earth is millions of years old. Mistake number 1. So we can ignore the equilibrium problem. Mistake number 2.
Oh my goodness. Some guy in the distant scientific past of 60 years ago said something wrong? That's nothing, Kent. Check this out. Some guy 2,400 years ago said diseases are caused by an imbalance in the humors. Therefore, modern science is dumb. Anyway, I'm just going to assume that everything you said about Libby is true, because in this case, it doesn't really matter if he said what you said he said, or if he said something totally different, or if he said nothing at all.
The Earth's atmosphere has still not reached equilibrium. There's more C14 now than there was 10 years ago, which proves the Earth is less than 30,000 years old.
Yikes. I'm disappointed in you, Kent. I'm not mad, just disappointed. See, old Henry Morris had this really awful argument that because the amount of carbon-14 has changed in recent years at such and such a rate, that meant we can assume that that was always the rate of change, and then extrapolating backwards meant that the Earth had to be under 10,000 years old. And before I started this video, I skipped through most of what you said, and I heard you talking about atmospheric C14 equilibrium, but I didn't hear you mention a number of years. And I thought that was a good sign. I thought you were just going to question the assumption that the amount of atmospheric C14 had remained constant for a long time, and discard the ridiculously flawed assertion about how C14 buildup points to a certain age for the Earth. I thought that you might have learned from Henry's mistake, but unfortunately, I overestimated you again. So, about Morris's argument, there was a critical flaw in his assumptions, which happens to be very similar to the one you just got done complaining was used by the scientists.
He said, well, it would take 30,000 years to reach equilibrium. He said, well, we know the Earth is millions of years old. Mistake number one. So we can ignore the equilibrium problem. Mistake number two.
Don't misinterpret based on that clip. I'm not saying that you or Morris assume that the amount of carbon-14 has been the same for millions of years. What I am saying is that you've made the same fundamental mistake that Libby made, according to you, which was what made him arrive at that 30,000 years figure in the first place. Maybe if I play this bit of your speech from a few seconds ago, you'll be able to figure out what I'm talking about.
Has it reached equilibrium? This is an interesting problem. If I told you to fill a barrel with water, but I drilled holes on the other side of the barrel, while you're filling it, it's leaking out. At some point, it's going to be leaking at the same speed you're filling, and that point is called equilibrium. You will never fill the barrel past that point, unless you plug the holes or fill faster.
So Kent, did you guess the problem? Nope. Okay. You said that it was a problem that scientists assumed that the atmospheric carbon-14 had reached equilibrium, or to use the terms of your analogy, that the amount of water in the barrel has been constant for millions of years. Remember? You said it was one of those
assumptions that mess everything up.
Yeah, those. And it is a faulty assumption. But that's only because it's based on another faulty assumption, a deeper one. And that's the same one you made, which is that the rate of carbon-14 production is constant. You assume for no reason whatsoever that the water pours out of that hose at a constant rate, specifically the present rate, which would lead up to permanent equilibrium at some point. But that's nothing more than unfounded conjecture, that things must have been the same all the time so we don't need to worry about whether they actually were. Now, to rebut you, here's the Kent Hovind of a couple minutes in the future talking about how he refuses to believe that the rate of carbon-14 decay was the same thousands of years ago, even though changing that would require a fundamental shift in the physics of the universe.
Now, when did that animal die? You don't have a clue. Unless you're willing to assume that the C14 when it was alive is the same as we have today, and assume the rate of decay has always been the same down through history. You can't prove either of those.
It makes you, the Kent Hovind of the present, seem a little bit hypocritical when you assert that the rate of carbon-14 production has always remained the same, even though changing that requires nothing more than a fluctuation in the Earth's magnetic field, which we know happens. If you insist on hoisting yourself with your own petard every time we talk, Kent, then I really don't see much reason for me to be here. I can leave you alone to argue with yourself if you'd prefer.
If we had walked into a room and found a candle burning on the table, and I asked you the question, when was it lit? You say, I don't know, Mr. Hovind, it was burning when I got here. Okay, well then let's do some empirical science. Empirical science is things we can test and measure and observe and test. Not theoretical, I mean empirical. We can measure it and weigh it. Let's measure the height of the candle. Suppose the candle is 7 inches tall. Who can tell me when it was lit? Okay, nobody. Let's do some more empirical science. Let's measure the rate of burn. Suppose we determine it's burning an inch an hour. When was it lit? How tall was it when it started? Oh, we don't have any idea.
Okay, let's figure out how we're supposed to map this analogy. So the current height of the candle is the current amount of carbon-14 in the specimen, and the burn rate is the half-life. Good. So your objection then is that you think there's absolutely no way to know the amount of carbon-14 that was likely in the specimen when it died. Now, instead of genuinely asking this question to your audience to see if they can think of a way that we might be able to figure that out, you conveniently chose an analogy in which determining the initial state is very difficult. So Kent, I reject your analogy, and I'm going to talk about what we're actually talking about instead. So, my audience, can you think of a way that we might be able to figure out at least a decent approximation of the initial amount of carbon-14 in a specimen? Remember the whole concept of cross-confirmation? Well, it sort of comes into play here too. Remember that there's sometimes more than one way to date something. So for example, tree rings provide a pretty reliable record of the tree's age. And if you take a living tree of a known age and you measure the amount of carbon-14 in each of its rings, you can plot the approximate amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere during each year going into the past. And if you do the same thing to a bunch of dead trees in the same area, there will be overlapping patterns in the carbon-14 content, and so you can create a reliable record of the atmospheric carbon-14 content that spans many thousands of years. Chart them out, and you have a handy calibration curve that you can use to take the uncalibrated dates of your sample and match them up with real dates by drawing a line from your sample's result over to the curve.
If it's giving you 4 clicks per minute, it's gone through 2 half-lives. It's going to be 11,000 years old. If it's 2 clicks per minute, it's 17,000 years old. This is how they date it. So if you're getting 2.5 clicks per minute, you just find the point on your graph and draw the line over and determine the age.
Why yes, Ken, thank you, just like that. Now, of course, because the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere changes up and down with time, your curve is unlikely to be nearly so nicely smooth. It's going to have all kinds of bumps and wiggles all over the place. And what that means is when you draw the line over, it might intersect the curve at multiple points, giving you a number of different possible dates. But even so, you're going to have a much better idea of the age than you started with. Before, you might have thought it had a range of several thousand years. But now you've narrowed it down to a small number of possibilities. Say 3,300 or 3,100 or 3,000. There are ways to increase the accuracy further, but I've made my point already, which is that calibration curves are useful tools developed using solid reasoning, and that if your sample matches up to a spot around the 40,000 year mark rather than the 1,000 year mark on your curve, it's a hell of a lot more reasonable to suppose that the sample is 40,000 years old than it is to suppose it's 1,000 years old, unless you have some kind of other evidence that contradicts it, or if there's some other factor which could modify the result, such as whether the organism lived in a marine environment, which tends to lead to different concentrations of carbon-14. Oh, and by the way, Kent, if that candle has wax trails all down the sides and a bunch of dried wax around the base, it might just be more reasonable to assume it was lit more than 2 seconds ago than to assume it was lit 2 seconds ago and the devil used his magic to make a realistic fake of a longer burnt candle, just to mess with your head and make you question your faith in the candle's freshness. Just saying.
Has it always burned out the same rate? We don't know that either, do we?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I'd say it's a lot more reasonable to assume that the wax of that lit candle burned at the same rate since it was lit, than to assume that the physical laws governing that burn were flopping around like a fresh-caught fish from the time it was lit until you entered the room. And similarly, it's a lot more reasonable to assume that the fundamental laws of physics governing the decay of carbon-14 have remained constant over the past few tens of thousands of years, than to assume, based on nothing but your inability to accept that your parents might have been wrong all along, that they've changed. How about you stop giving your little speech here and you start getting your hands dirty doing some actual science, and maybe someday you'll find some evidence that they have changed.
Living mollusk shells were carbon dated at 2,300 years old.
You had to go back to 1963 to find that one, eh? That's only, 38 years before your speech? Must be a real common occurrence. Living mollusks from areas with very low carbon-14 concentrations will date excessively old. This is known. And that's why, as I said, you need to take factors such as location into consideration before you rely too heavily on that date, and you should cross-confirm the date if you have some way to do so. For example, by noting that the mollusk is alive. This discrepancy would lead one to check if the area of the find would naturally have unusually low quantities of carbon-14. Unfortunately, Kent, you actually do need to be careful and thoughtful when you do science. There's actually some complexity to radiocarbon dating which has to be respected if you want to achieve an accurate result. This concept is shocking to creationists, I know. But I swear to you on the soul of my father, Domingo Montoya, it's true. Anyway, Kent, I'm skipping the rest of what you say on this subject because you spend a couple minutes effectively repeating yourself, all in service of making one point. You've gathered up a few examples of flawed dates that were produced in the 1960s or 1970s, and even as late as the 1980s, which is impressive for you, from all kinds of different sources that I definitely am not going to bother wasting money on when there's nothing here to debunk. So you've carefully cherry-picked these few examples of failed dating down through the decades, and the fact that you had to resort to such old examples must mean it happens all the fucking time, and the point is that because sometimes errors or contamination or whatever else will result in a wrong date, which I promise you the people doing this dating are perfectly aware of, carbon dating in general is totally unreliable. So what possible motivation would I have to go through your examples one at a time if the only reason for them being there is to support a point that's critically logically flawed regardless of whether your examples are real or not? No, we're done. This is ridiculous. I'll see you next time.
You're a